Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history and continuing the unit on the 11th century. We left off last time with the death of Pope St. Leo IX on the 10th of April, 1054, and it was during his reign, though it was not his fault, that the schism occurred between Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic. So picking up there, Pope 153, Victor II. His name was Gebhard of Dahlenstein-Hirschberg. He was of a German a German noble family who cared absolutely nothing about the schism with the Greek Orthodox. So when he was elected Pope Victor II on the 16th of April, 1055, he made absolutely no effort to resolve it. As a younger son, he was sent into the church. He was naturally talented, so he quickly rose to become Bishop of Eichstätt while still in his 20s. He came to the attention of the Emperor Heinrich III and became a trusted advisor. When Pope Leo was found dead next to his coffin, Henry nominated Victor as his successor. In the climate of the day, this assured his election as Pope. The Holy Roman Emperor, in his turn, Heinrich III, died unexpectedly on the 5th of October, 1056. This left his 5-year-old son and heir as officially the monarch. Pope Victor convinced the German nobility to recognize this boy as Rex, as king, Heinrich or Henry IV, with his mother Agnes as regent. To ensure that that the family would not be victimized, Pope Victor also mediated a reconciliation between Germany and two of its powerful antagonists, Godfrey of Lorraine and Baldwin of Flanders. He obtained Godfrey's support in a manner typical of feudalism by naming Godfrey's brother Frederick abbot of Monte Cassino, as well as appointing him a cardinal. This Frederick had been a strong supporter of Leo IX and had even been on the delegation that began the Great Schism. It is not known what Victor would have done to purchase peace from Baldwin of Flanders, because Victor died suddenly. He died officially. He contracted a fever, one of the summer fevers, and he died 5 days later on July 28th, 1057. The next Pope, 154, was none other than Frederick, the brother of Godfrey of Lorraine, whom Victor II had just named Cardinal and Abbot of Monte Cassino. A younger son of Duke Goslin of Lorraine, as Pope, Frederick took the name Stephen. So, remember the Stephen problem. So this is Stephen IX, but with 10 in parentheses next to it because of the Stephen problem. He had been educated at Liège and became a canon there under the Cluny-inspired Reformed bishops. Leo IX brought him to Rome as his chancellor and trusted advisor. He was with Leo on the disastrous Norman campaign had been captured with him, though the Normans allowed him to go to Constantinople on the ill-fated delegation led by Cardinal Humbert. In 1057, troubled, like his predecessors, by Norman expansion in southern Italy, which was assuming an aspect of permanence, Pope Stephen planned to finance a war against the Normans from the treasury of Monte Cassino. To lead the expedition, he made overtures to his brother Godfrey of Lorraine, in return for which Stephen would crown his brother Holy Roman Emperor. But before these plans could mature, the Pope dropped dead suddenly on the 29th of March, 1058. Upon the sudden death of Pope Stephen, a powerful nativist faction, or Italian faction, Roman faction, elected Bishop John of Vercelli, who turned out to be an anti-pope. And as anti-pope, he took a name, excuse me. Sorry about that. Upon the sudden death of Pope Stephen IX on the 29th of March, 1058, the Italian Roman faction elected Bishop John of Vercelli as what turned out to be an anti-pope. The reformers fled Rome and elected Gerard, who was a native of French Burgundy and Bishop of Florence since 1045. They elected him as the real pope, Nicholas II. This is Pope 155. Supported by Godfrey of Lorraine's troops, the reformers returned the rightful pope to Rome, where he was officially installed on the 24th of January, 1059. He retained all of the reforming crowd, most notably Hildebrand, Humbert, and Peter Damian. Together, they took a momentous step in the history of papal elections. On the 13th of April, 1059, a synod met at the Lateran and decreed, among other things, a new electoral procedure for the papacy to offset the possibility of simony, as well as other forms of interference. We've seen a myriad ways of interference in the election of popes. Namely, their reform was that the pope should be elected first by the senior cardinals meeting in private, in conclave, which means with key. So in other words, like only they had the key to get in, and or conversely, they would be locked in, and they would not have the key to get out. Then the cardinal priest should be brought in to ratify the decision. Then it should be brought to the clergy and people of Rome. So this is the beginning of the papal conclaves of today. Now, of course, there'll be adjustments along the way. As it limited the right of initial election to senior cardinals, meaning bishops, cardinals who were also bishops, meeting in secret, and that would change later. Now it's all the cardinals under the age of 80. The synod then passed decrees repeating decrees of previous reforming popes against clerical marriage and against concubinage. The fact that these prohibitions had to be repeated means, or suggests, that the previous prohibitions were not being obeyed. This time, they added an interesting clause with historic importance. The Synod forbade the practice of lay investiture. And we talked previously about what that means, and soon we will talk about it a great deal more. Politically, Nicholas, like his predecessors, had to face the Norman problem in southern Italy, but he came up with a very different solution than his predecessors, correctly deducing that the Normans were too proficient in battle, too well armed, to be ousted. On the 23rd of August, 1059, at a synod held in Melfi, Nicholas simply formed an alliance with the Normans. He cemented this by creating new titles. He found out the Normans, they liked that, so he came up with some new titles. He came up with for Robert Guiscard, he came up with the title of Dominus Italicum, the Lord of Italy. And for his younger brother, he gave him the title Prince of Capua, Princeps Capuorum. All right. At this point, the next year, we catch up with St. Anselm again. St. Anselm visited the Abbey of Bec in Normandy in 1060. When initially, when he met Abbot Herwin, he saw just another thug like his own father, someone with a barbarian temperament, warlike. So he planned to just continue his search, just looking around for what to do with his life. But before he left, he met the prior of Bec, Lanfranc. Lanfranc had just returned from Rome from the third condemnation of Berengar of Tours. This Berengar proposed a Eucharistic heresy, which seminarians, I assume you cover that in your course on the Eucharist. When Lanfranc met Anselm, discerning at his monastery in Bec, Lanfranc was 28 years older than Anselm and had earned an unimpeachable reputation for his learning and his faithfulness. And as we said previously, and as when we read for Pope Benedict's reflection on Anselm, Lanfranc became the father that Anselm really never knew. I mean, he had a biological father, but this was a father that they understood each other. So Anselm became a monk at the Abbey in 1060. The immediate spiritual problem which Lanfranc identified in his young novice was the problem of scrupulosity. That is, the paralyzing habit of believing sin has been committed when there was no cause for such belief. Now, for seminarians, you can refresh your memories. The Catechism, number 1784, is on the proper formation of conscience. Numbers 1790 through 94 are about the erroneous conscience, which in part is what scrupulosity is. There's also the other, erroneous conscience can also be at the other end of the spectrum, where it's so numbed and deadened that it doesn't recognize a sin when a sin has in fact been committed. And Numbers 1852 through 1864 are on the different kinds of sin, mortal sin, venial sin, etc. So if you wish, pause and reread those to catch up, or not. Recall, Lanfranc's original training had been with the Guild of Lawyers. He carried this practical approach to organizing knowledge and stating his positions throughout his life. In this case, it proved of some usefulness to him in spiritual direction. He imposed a particular approach on Anselm under holy obedience, as an antidote to scrupulosity. The application was as follows. First, when the emotion associated with guilt manifested, Anselm was first to identify a specific act as the cause. Now, it could be a thought. I mean, thoughts can be sinful too, but entertaining those thoughts is an act. So, and then of course there is the actual, there's physical action where, you might have a thought of anger, and if you deliberately give into that and entertain that, well, then there is some guilt there. But then there's also the physical act, like if you choose to act on it, take a hammer and bash somebody's skull in, then that's escalating it. But it's part of a continuity, or continuum, I should say. Second, if Anselm could not identify a specific act that caused this emotion of guilt, then he was not permitted to come to confession. Second, if he could identify a specific act, then evaluate the moral valence of that act, of that cause, in terms of the commandments, the Beatitudes, the 7 deadly sins. Third, list the specific ways in which the act offended against any of those. Only then if he had successfully gone through that, if he could actually do all of those, only then was he permitted to bring the matter to sacramental confession. If what he presented in confession was not in fact sinful, but was only a manifestation of scrupulosity, then Lanfranc gave him a penance for misusing the sacrament and for the sin of doubting the mercy of God. Now, that's one approach. There's no, this is just me now, not Lanfranc, but there's no real cure to scrupulosity unless God sends an infused grace of healing. But scrupulosity can be treated, so to speak. It can be resisted through such a method. And Anselm continued to struggle with it for his entire life, so this didn't cure it, but it did give him a way to handle it. Because they're dangerous, that with scrupulosity. It's not just misusing the sacrament of confession, that a person can get so emotionally exhausted that they give in to despair and might actually lose their faith over it, to think, okay, I'm so sinful, I'm so worthless, I'm doomed. I'm just going to go to hell, no matter what. So why bother trying anymore? And so it is a real danger. In terms of Anselm's contribution to philosophy and theology, the imposition of this method on Anselm directed his mind into a logical and analytical approach to the world that was rooted in the practicality of his mentor's legal training. In each case, he used these tools for particular purposes to respond to specific situations, rather than entertain meaningless academic speculation. As Anselm was never attached to any of the guilds of scholars which were creating the constructs that eventually became universities. And we'll cover, I think, 3 examples of Anselm's actual writing later when we get to it in the chronology. So at this point, he's getting sort of an advanced training from Lanfranc. He's getting a supplemental formation, an upgrade in his formation from Lanfranc. So we'll leave him there, and then we'll meet him again later in the century. Pope Nicholas II's alliance with the Normans in Naples and Sicily was an imaginative response to a particular problem, but it did have repercussions. The papacy, as we've seen, had close ties of long duration with the German royal house. The Normans, though descended from the Vikings, ultimately Scandinavia, so ultimately related to the Germans. But they were not pure anymore, from the perspective of that because the Normans had intermarried with the French. Therefore, from a country hostile, with long hostility, Germany and France, because they hated each other, at each other's throats, into the 20th century. The Germans therefore interpreted this alliance of Nicholas as a betrayal of them, instead of just seeing it for what it was. It was a practical and necessary step to neutralize a particular problem. But they chose to regard it as a betrayal. In 1061, a synod of German bishops broke off relations, to use diplomatic speak, with Pope Nicholas, with the Holy See, and declared all of his acts null and void in German territory. And this was a serious breach which could lead to a schism. And eventually, that is kind of what happened with the Protestant movements. It was at the national level that the initial Protestant movements broke away from the church. But before Nicholas could respond, he died in Florence on the 26th of July, 1061. The reformers, the Cluny party, now elected Hildebrand. Now led. They haven't not elected him yet. They're still led. They're led by Hildebrand, who's going to be the future Gregory VII. Managed to elect a former monk from the Abbey of Bec, Anselm's Abbey, elected him as Pope Gregory, God, it's just been one of those days, as Pope Alexander II. Now, just to confuse things, this guy's name was also Anselm. All right, he's from the same abbey at Bec, where the Saint Anselm we've been covering, where he was. This guy was Anselm, also Anselm. At the time, he was serving as Bishop of Lucca in Italy, and another student of Lanfranc of Bec, from the Scola in Bec, but is not the same Anselm. So this guy, there's no Pope Anselm, so he didn't keep his name as Pope. This is Pope Alexander II. He inherited the German problem, the imperiled papal relations with Germany over the Norman alliance. The Germans never gave him a chance. They instantly created an anti-pope, and which caused civil unrest in Rome at the time of the election. Urban violence ensued, and Alexander, the new pope, the real pope's life was in danger. And surprisingly, to those who had seen him fight or maybe had dinner with him, the Normans kept their word. They had made an alliance with the previous pope, and they gave their word. And so now the pope was in trouble, so they came to the rescue. And so Pope Alexander could be properly installed. In 1063, he hosted a synod at the Lateran to further the cause of reform. As usual, he repeated all the previous condemnations of simony, lay investiture, clerical marriage, concubinage. But he added, so you see each one, now they're adding something. So this one added forbidding the faithful to attend masses celebrated by married priest, which tells us that, not only were there some priests who were ignoring the previous commands to dispose of their wives, but there were members of the faithful who didn't care that they were ignoring this papal teaching and were still going to Mass. So this reform added that prohibition that the faithful were not permitted to go to Masses celebrated by a married priest. In the same year, 1063, Lanfranc was named founding abbot of a new monastery in Caen, Normandy. That's C-A-E-N, Normandy. Not Cannes, as in where the movie awards, the French movie awards. That's C-A-N-N-E-S. That's in southern France. but this is in Normandy, northwest France. The new monastery was under the patronage of St. Stephen. After Lanfranc departed, the good abbot Herlwin, still abbot at Bec, agreed that Anselm would make a splendid prior, following his teacher Lanfranc, even though Anselm had only been in the monastery for 3 years. The matter was put to the community, or at least those in the chapter, those who had made final vows, final profession, in the chapter, and they agreed. St. Anselm was elected prior in 1063. 3 years later, 1066, history changed again. For the church, for Western Europe, ultimately for the world, considering what's going to happen, and specifically for Anselm. And that is the Norman conquest of England. So remember, I told you the Normans, they're going to keep, interfering with the machinery of history and diverting it in other courses. So 20 years earlier, we saw Norman knights making use of their military training to carve out a kingdom for themselves, Naples and Sicily, establishing the dynasty of de Hauteville. Their example would be followed by other Normans, most famously by a group led by Duke William of Normandy to carve a kingdom for himself by conquering England. The opportunity presented as follows. On the 5th of January, 1066, St. Edward the Confessor died. St. Edward the Confessor was an Anglo-Saxon king of England. Now, there are some that'll, they'd say he was the last Anglo-Saxon king, but that's not true, as we'll see. There was one more, the one who William defeated. So William did not defeat Edward the Confessor. He died, but he died childless. So this, is one of the problems with monarchy. Because of the complicated history of England, with the old Romans having been defeated and replaced by Anglo-Saxon invaders, who were in turn constantly at war with Danish Vikings, who occupied part of the island, there were numerous claimants, numerous guys who, because of descent, marriage, whatever, could put forward a plausible claim to follow Edward as king. The Anglo-Saxon claimant was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. The Viking claimant was also named Harold, just to confuse things, Harold Hardrada, but they're spelled differently. So Harold Godwinson is Harold. Harold Hardrada is Harald. The third claimant was the Duke of Normandy, William. William was the grand nephew of Emma of Norway, who married first an Anglo-Saxon king named Ethelred, and then married a Viking king who occupied central England, and his name was Canute. So from that descent, which is tenuous, but still, he did have some claim. It's really going to be his men, the guys with swords, who are going to make the claim all of a sudden legitimate. Earl Harold of Wessex had the home field advantage. He was already there. He had the support of the Anglo-Saxons, so he was crowned King of England first in January of 1066. Harold of Norway decided to take advantage of his tenuous claim to the English throne and do what the Vikings had been doing for the past 300 years. He assembled 300 longships to make a raid on England for the purpose of taking the crown for himself and colonizing more Vikings in England. Duke William of Normandy had been raised with a Viking mentality and came to the same conclusion. But it took him longer to assemble his forces than it took Harold the Viking. So the Vikings invaded northern England in September of 1066, where they proceeded to do the Viking thing: burn, pillage, rape. King Harold now, King Harold Godwinson, engaged and defeated them, killing Harold the Viking at the Battle of Stamford Bridge outside of York on the 25th of September, 1066. So there's a story, well cherished in English history, that before the battle, the two Harolds met. And Harold the Viking, said, basically let it be known that he was willing to be bought off with land, and didn't see a problem with that, since Canute, other Vikings had, parts of English land. And supposedly King Harold the Anglo-Saxon responded that yes, he was willing to allow Harold the Viking English land. Specifically, he would grant him 6 feet of English earth in which to be buried. Naturally, Harold the Viking refused that offer, and they fought the battle, but Harold the Viking lost and ended up needing those 6 feet of English earth to be buried in. 3 days later, on the 28th of September, 1066, Duke William of Normandy landed at Pevensey Bay, at the opposite end of England. So Battle of Stamford Bridge was in the north of England, and Pevensey Bay is in the south of England. He landed with 7,000 Norman warriors, including the good Abbot Hurlwyn, the Axe, who was not about to miss such an adventure. Anselm, the prior, remained at Bec, fulfilling his duties, while the good Abbot Hurlwyn enjoyed the fun. King Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon, immediately marched his men after a battle. I mean, once he heard that, it marched his men 241 miles south from York to engage this new invader. With his men exhausted after the march, but determined to protect their homes, the Anglo-Saxons made their stand at Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066. Now, they did not fear the Normans because they had just defeated the Vikings in the previous month. But what they had not anticipated was the difference in fighting styles. The Normans were culturally descended from the Vikings, but for generations now, for over a century now, they had intermarried with and were raised in that French milieu, so they were trained as French knights. The Anglo-Saxons fought as infantry with the shield wall, the body length shield, and they put up a stiff resistance. King Harold himself fought to the death. He had an arrow in his eye. But in the end, the Anglo-Saxons were overcome by this new military reality of Vikings with the training of French knights. It's said that the Anglo-Saxon shield wall held for the first 2 charges by the Normans, and that it actually did hold for the third, that it did not break from the Norman advance, but when the Normans were going to pull back and regroup for another one, it was later in the day. The Anglo-Saxons thought they had won the day, so that they broke the shield wall to pursue the Normans. But since the Normans were not actually retreating, they were just moving back to reposition, that, they didn't run away, panicked. They just reformed. And then without the formation, the Anglo-Saxons, without their formation, it was hand-to-hand, man-to-man. And then the Normans just had better armor and better equipment, better training. And so that's what did it. And so Duke William of Normandy became King William the Conqueror, crowned King of England in London on Christmas Day, 1066. In a bitter irony for the locals, the ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, built and lovingly cared for by the late King Edward the Confessor. Pope Alexander II, as we saw, had studied at the Abbey of Bec in Normandy. His favorite teacher there was Lanfranc, who had been introduced to Abbot Hurlwyn by Robert, the father of William the Conqueror. As no, skip that. Anyway, I'll just say Lanfranc was able to perform some services for William's family canonically, using his legal background. He was able to get some dispensations that William needed in order to marry Matilda, the daughter of the Count of Flanders. So, with this background and all these connections, and given the feudalism, it will come as no surprise that Lanfranc would end up as Archbishop of Canterbury in England, because England was now an extension of Normandy. The position became vacant in 1070, and William welcomed the Pope's appointment of Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury. Meanwhile, while all this is going on in England, northwestern France and England, something at the opposite end of what the old Roman Empire occurred, that is yet another step toward the crusading movement. In 1067, so 1 year after William became William the Conqueror, and 3 years before Lanfranc became Archbishop of Canterbury, a nomadic tribe, recently converted to Islam, erupted from Central Asia into the awareness of the West. They once followed a chieftain named Seljuk, Seljuk, and they named themselves after him. But history knows them as the Turks. The Byzantine Empire at the time was ruled by a person who was Romanus IV, completely overwhelmed. I mean, completely at a loss, paralyzed by indecision as to what to do, and watched supine as the Turks absorbed one Byzantine province after another after another. Finally, after years of inactivity, Romanus's generals assembled every soldier they could find to make a gamble, to gamble everything, but the whole army, on one battle, to halt the Turkish advance. The Byzantines engaged the Turks at Manzikert, near Lake Van in Armenia. The battle occurred on the 26th of August, 1071. And it is one of the decisive battles of world history, given what happened, as the Turks completely annihilated the Christian army and captured the emperor. This event is another step toward the Crusades. It's another in the sequence of events moving toward the Crusade. Pope Alexander II died on the 21st of April, 1073. He was followed by a guy we've met a few times, Hildebrand, Pope 157. He was supported by the de Hauteville, the Normans ruling Naples, Sicily, and as Pope, he took the name Gregory VII. He had to deal with 3 anti-popes, all put forward, by different people, but because he had the support of the Normans militarily, at least initially, he was safe. So we'll see how that situation turns and why it turns shortly. Hildebrand had been Pope Alexander's closest advisor, also had been a fixture among the Roman reformers since the reign of Leo IX. He took the name Gregory VII. This is now recognized as a saint, so this is Saint Gregory VII. He accepted election on the 22nd of April, 1073. He was trained in the Cluny system, had proven skill and experience as an administrator, which earned him positions as a papal treasurer, diplomatic representative, and chancellor of the Holy See. He was the administrative mastermind behind the consistent papal policies of reform for the previous 20 years. He traveled throughout Europe. He knew everyone, in the at least the upper echelons of both church and state and all the kingdoms, and he knew where they stood on the issues of importance to the church. He was elected unanimously by the conclave on the first ballot. To reinforce his exalted view of the papacy, he deliberately omitted the customary notification of the emperor. Instead of the notification, Gregory sent the emperor, who was Heinrich IV. Remember, we met him when he was a child. Well, he's getting older now. Gregory sent him a letter expressing his hope that the young Heinrich would willingly work with the Pope for the promotion of moral uprightness and accept the wise counsel of his elder. This was received by Heinrich as one might expect such a message to be received by a 22-year-old who had been king since the age of 5. He was furious. Before we see the result, during the reign of Gregory VII, St. Anselm made contributions to medieval scholarship that have endured. And then later he's going to make contributions to medieval ecclesiology and practice when he gets a transfer. But for now, we can't talk about all of his works because he was very prolific. But there are a few of them that are important. While still at Bec, so while still in this period, Anselm composed a work called the Monologion, which is a monologue. The subject was on reason and faith. It was written between 1075 and 1076 as a reasoned reflection on the being of God, the existence of God. And it ends up, he talks a lot about the Trinity, of course, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So here's an excerpt from chapter 1. Quote, "There is a being which is best and greatest and highest of all existing beings. If any man, either from ignorance or unbelief, has no knowledge of the existence of one nature, which is highest of all existing beings, which is also sufficient to itself in its eternal blessedness, and which confers upon and effects in all other beings, through its omnipotent goodness, the very fact of their existence, and the fact that in any way their existence is good. And if he has no knowledge of many other things, which we necessarily believe regarding God and his creatures, he still believes that he can at least convince himself of these truths in great part, even if his mental powers are very ordinary, by the force of reason alone." Okay, let that sink in. So we're going to read more of the excerpt to see how he develops that. But all of that I just read is one sentence. One sentence. So this is one issue with medieval Latin, is the syntax. That was a problem with classical Latin too, but also that they have these sentences that in English are would be run-on sentences, and so the thought, and he's talking about things that are very complicated anyway, but writing about it this way makes the complicated topic even more complicated because you're thinking, okay, what exactly is the sentence saying? So in this case, this is the introduction. This is the beginning. So he's explaining, a man can be confused. A person can be confused in their thoughts, in their conceptions, but they still do possess reason. And that reason can be misformed and misused, and therefore arrive at erroneous conclusions. But the reverse is also true. reason that has been misformed or poorly trained can be correctly trained by way of antidote. And so that's how he sets up this monologue, is what he's doing. Okay, so continuing the quote. And although he could do this in many ways, I shall adopt one which I consider easiest for such a man. For since all desire to enjoy only those things which they suppose to be good, it is natural that this man should, at some time, turn his mind's eye to the examination of that cause by which these things are good, which he does not desire, except as he judges them to be good. So that, as reason leads the way and follows up these considerations, he advances rationally to those truths of which, without reason, he has no knowledge. And if, in this discussion, I use any argument which no greater authority adduces, I wish it to be received in this way. Although, on the grounds that I shall see fit to adopt, the conclusion is reached as if necessarily, yet it is not, for this reason, said to be absolute necessary, but merely that it can appear so for the time being. All right, so you got that? All right, so that he's addressing those, so he's asserting that God gave us reason, so we can use reason to reflect on God. Now, some people's reason, they've been poorly trained or maybe not trained at all, but they still have reason. They still have that faculty, and so he's going to train them that way. So he's telling them, if what I say at first does not make sense, then just be patient, and you will see as I develop it how it all comes together and does make sense. Continuing the quote, it is easy then for one to say to himself, since there are goods so innumerable, whose great diversity we experience by the bodily senses, and discern by our mental faculties, we must not believe that there is some one thing through which all goods, whatever, are good. Or are they good one through one thing, and another through another thing? So he's setting up, and he's going to respond to this. So he said, that there are those who would say, well, why bother trying to find one cause for all the good things? There are many good things, and maybe they all have different causes. So, if you're hungry, then a good is eating food, and then you enjoy that. If you're thirsty, there's a good is consuming water, and there's good to that. If you like pretty weather, so he's saying that that those who, because their reason was not properly formed, might assume or might just infer, if they thought about it at all, that each good has its own distinct cause. Whereas he's asserting, even if there's a proximate cause for that to properly train the reason, you have to go back to the source, and that source is going to be one cause for all that's good, and that's God. Continuing the quote, to be sure, it is most certain and clear for all who are willing to see that whatsoever things are said to possess any attribute in such a way that in mutual comparison they may be said to possess it in greater or less or equal degree, are said to possess it by virtue of some fact, which is not understood to be one thing in one cause and another thing in another cause, but to be the same in different cases, whether it is regarded as existing in these cases in equal or unequal measure. So God is ultimately behind everything, even if it doesn't seem so. It might seem more obvious that God is behind the sacraments, or specifically things in church, but Anselm's asserting that if it's good, anything that you experience is good, then ultimately God is the cause. 4. Whatsoever things are said to be just, when compared with one another, whether equally or more or less, cannot be understood as just, except through the quality of justness, which is not one thing in one instance and another thing in another instance, that there is one justice. Since it is certain, then, that all goods, if mutually compared, would prove either equally or unequally good, necessarily they are all good by virtue of something which is conceived of as the same in different goods. although sometimes they seem to be called good, the one by virtue of one thing, the other by virtue of another. For, apparently, it is by virtue of one quality that a horse is called good, because he is strong, and by virtue of another, that he is called good, because he is swift. For, though he seems to be called good by virtue of his strength, and good by virtue of his swiftness, yet swiftness and strength do not appear to be the same thing. But if a horse, because he is strong and swift, is therefore good, how is it that a strong, swift robber is bad? Rather then, just as a strong, swift robber is bad because he is harmful, so a strong, swift horse is good because he is useful. And indeed, nothing is ordinarily regarded as good except either for some utility, as for instance, safety is called good, and those things which promote safety, or for some honorable character, as for instance, beauty is reckoned to be good, and what promotes beauty is reckoned to be good. But since the reasoning which we have observed is in no ways refutable, necessarily, again, all things, whether useful or honorable, if they are truly good, are good through that same being through which all goods exist, whatever that being is. Now, later, of course, it's going to be God, so he's leading you. But who can doubt this very being through which all goods exist, whatever that being is? I messed along. But who can doubt this very being through which all goods exist to be a great good? This must be, then, a good in itself, since every other good is through it. It follows, therefore, that all other goods are good through another being than that which they themselves are. And this being alone is good through itself. Hence, this alone is supremely good, which is alone good through itself. For it is supreme, in that it so surpasses other beings, that it is neither equaled nor excelled. But that which is supremely good is also supremely great. There is, therefore, some one being, which is supremely good and supremely great, that is the highest of all existing beings. Okay, so he goes on and he develops its long argument. So, but that's I read is, so you see, not only is so we see a few things here. So if you remember from things we talked about earlier, certainly seminarians remember from your philosophy classes and from the patristics class, this is Platonism. This is completely influenced by Plato, and the real and the ideal. You know, that there is an objective good, you know, and so he's building on that. Now Plato obviously, you know, was pagan because he lived 3 centuries before the incarnation, but building on that idea of the real and the ideal, that it is in the realm of metaphysics, that which exists beyond. So Catholic thought it always goes from the top down. So correct reasoning always begins with the divinity, and then we reason down from that. As if we start, you know, with the effect, if we then try to reason our way back, it's possible to do that, but because it goes through us and we're tainted by sin and error, it's more likely we'll make a mistake in the reasoning than if we start with the metaphysics and work our way down. And this is a case where we could. So that saying, you know, okay, that first he addresses, all right, there are many things that we call good that seem to be different, so maybe they all have different causes. Okay, so he dealt with that. Then he goes, well, okay, if there are many things that are called good that appear to be different, but there's one good, there's one quality of goodness, you know, that which is good for the person, and then later he'll go and develop it. That which is good spiritually, morally, theologically, and ultimately eschatologically, in terms of our soteriologically, in terms of our salvation, to ultimately go to heaven. But it takes them a long time. We don't have time to read all of it. But this is enough for you to see the nature of the reasoning, the way they wrote in the Middle Ages, and how Plato makes his way in there. And later we're going to see those that use Aristotle and how that happened and the differences between them. So he's making his argument from metaphysics down, that there is an objective good, and that is not necessarily irrefutably bound up to the qualities. Like he mentioned, swiftness and strength. Well, that's good in the horse, but not good in the robber. So that means goodness is something above. The quality, the judgment of goodness is something that exists above that. And then he'll develop that too when he gets to the moral section. What is goodness? What makes a good life? But it all is going to go back in reference to God. That's how you figure all this out. Let's see, there was one. I thought there was one other thing I wanted. Anyway, okay, so I think that's pretty clear. A second one that we're going to cover that he wrote during his time at Beck is the proslogium, which means a discourse. Originally entitled Fides Quaerens Intellectum, Faith Seeking Understanding. And then it had a title, An Address on God's Existence, Eloquium Dei Existentia. But ultimately the proslogion, just simply the discourse. It was written over 2 years, 1077 to 78. And Plato, again, it is written in the form of an extended direct address to God. It contains his ontological argument for the existence of God. So we also will read an excerpt. This is from chapter 2, reflecting that God really exists. Quote, "Therefore, Lord," so that's the literary convention. He's addressing the deity. "Therefore, Lord, you who give knowledge of the faith, give me as much knowledge as you know to be fitting for me, because you are, as we believe, and that which we believe. And indeed, we believe you are something greater than which cannot be thought." Something greater than which cannot be thought. That's all right. Now, all right. So the ontological proof for the existence of God is tied up with this. So it's awkward when translated into English, but so we believe, the faithful believe that the divinity is something greater than which cannot be thought. All right, keep that in mind. Now, continuing the quote. Or is there no such kind of thing? For the fool said in his heart, there is no God. That's a reference to the book of Psalms. But certainly that same fool, having heard what I just said, something greater than which cannot be thought, understands what he heard, and what he understands is in his thought, even if he does not think it exists. For it is one thing for something to exist in a person's thought, and quite another for the person to think that thing exists. All right, let that sink in. You see the distinction there. So it's while a person can think a thing exists, it's quite another. It's one thing for a person for something to exist in a person's thought, and another for a person to think that thing actually exists. The purple elephant analogy. You can conceive in your mind an image of a purple elephant. But does the purple elephant really exist? So those are two different things. And he gives an example also, which is better than mine. So, for when a painter thinks ahead to what he will paint, he has that picture in his thought, but he does not yet think it exists because he hasn't done it. Once he has painted it, he has it in his thought and thinks it exists because he has done it. Thus, even the fool is compelled to grant that something greater than which cannot be thought exists in thought, because he understands what he hears, and whatever is understood exists in thought, and certainly that greater than which cannot be understood cannot exist only in thought. For if it exists only in thought, it could also be thought of as existing in reality as well, which is greater. If, therefore, that than which greater cannot be thought exists in thought alone, then that than which greater cannot be thought turns out to be that than which something greater actually can be thought. But that is obviously impossible. Therefore, something than which greater cannot be thought undoubtedly exists, both in thought and in reality. All right, this is the kind of argument that in the West now, whether we realize it or not, we've been completely taken over by Aristotelian thought, which is empiricism, and so that's why metaphysical arguments like this sound so awkward. He could make that argument in the Middle Ages because they shared that same kind of metaphysical cosmology, at least at this point. That's going to break down in the next century that we cover. But anyway, the argument is persuasive to me because I already believe. So, and the same for you. I mean, if you, anyway, let me read this next chapter, and then not the whole chapter, just the next excerpt. Now, this is from chapter 3. That God cannot be thought not to exist. So Anselm is asserting that atheism is impossible. Quote, in fact, it so undoubtedly exists that it cannot be thought of as not existing. For one can think there exists something that cannot be thought of as not existing, and that would be greater than something which can be thought of as not existing. For if that greater than which cannot be thought can be thought of as not existing, then that greater than which cannot be thought is not that greater than which cannot be thought, which does not make sense. Thus, that than which nothing can be thought so undoubtedly exists that it cannot even be thought of as not existing. And you, Lord God, are this being. You exist so undoubtedly, my Lord God, that you cannot even be thought of as not existing. And deservedly, for if some mind could think of something greater than you, that creature would rise above the Creator and could pass judgment on the Creator, which is absurd. And indeed, whatever exists except you alone can be thought of as not existing. You alone, of all things, most truly exist, and thus enjoy existence to the fullest degree of all things, because nothing else exists so undoubtedly, and thus everything else enjoys being in a lesser degree. Why, therefore, did the fool say in his heart, there is no God? Since it is so evident to any rational mind that you above all things do exist. Why, indeed, except precisely because he is stupid and foolish. Okay, so this is Anselm's argument. It's often called an argument for the existence of God, but Anselm didn't really think the existence of God had to be proven. So this is a discourse on the nature of God, as in terms of cause, that God is the uncaused cause. Like everything else, you can trace it back. And Aquinas will develop this too in one of his 5 proofs for the existence of God, the argument from cause. It's like, I exist. Where did I come from? Okay, I came from my parents. Or where did they exist? It so goes back. So you can trace back a cause to everything except God. Because God is eternal. God has no cause because God always was. He was eternal. And so God is the cause of everything that happened. Now that's Catholic metaphysics. So he can make these assertions that it's not possible to conceive of God not existing because he was existing with that medieval metaphysics. Now, I've met atheists, and many, maybe you have too, who would certainly dispute that. They claim that they absolutely can conceive of God not existing. Now there are others who would say, well, that's really not. They're just substituting. So their reverence and worship is for reason, is for human reason, or whatever, empiricism, whatever their thing is, instead of the divinity. So in that case, they're not conceiving of the divinity as not existing. They're just conceiving of it as being something other than the way the church defines divinity. But they're still giving their worship to something higher than themselves. And that, so, all right. Third work of his that we'll cover, chronologically, it was the last of the three we'll cover, and then we have to get back to the history. This is Cur Deus Homo, why God was man, or why God became man. Written between 1095 and 1098. This was in response to request for written discussion and exposition of the incarnation of Christ. It takes the form of a dialogue, Plato, so Platonic dialogue, between Anselm and Boso, B-O-S-O, one of his students, or Basso, I suppose, if you want to. Although I think Basso would have two S's, but I guess it's better. Basso is better than Boso. Its core of the work is a rational argument for the necessity of the Christian mystery of atonement. Why did God become human? To suffer and die. Well, why was that? Okay, so that's what he's reflecting on. Of the Catholic theology of atonement. Okay, we'll start with an excerpt from chapter 5. How the redemption of man could not be effected by any other being but God. So, Brother Basso comments, quote, if this deliverance were said to be effected somehow by any other being than God, whether it were an angelic or a human being, the mind of man would receive it far more patiently. For God could have made some man without sin, not of a sinful substance, and not a descendant of any man, but just as he made Adam. And by this man it should seem that the work we speak of could have been done. Anselm responds, do you not perceive that if any other being should rescue man from eternal death, man would rightly be adjudged as the servant of that being? Now, if this be so, he would in no ways be restored to that dignity which would have been his had he never sinned. For he, who was to be through eternity only the servant of God and an equal with the holy angels, would now be the servant of a being who was not God, and whom the angels did not serve. All right, so he develops the whole thing. So essentially the original sin, was an offense against the divinity, against the all-powerful, omnipotent, divinity. Therefore, it is an offense of infinite degree. Therefore, an individual human cannot atone for that, because we do not encompass the infinity. Like our nature is of insufficient valence to counterweight that. Whereas Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, is divine. So his sacrifice is also of infinite value, of infinite valence, and that can atone for the infinite offense that we committed. But not if he's just God, is then he has nothing to atone for. But if he's both God and man, which is Catholic theology, as we covered in previous sessions, he's God and man, then as human, he can make the sacrifice on our behalf. And as God, that sacrifice is perfect. So that's what he develops, and that's the Catholic theology of atonement. Okay, back to the chronology. In Lent of 1075, Pope Gregory VII held a synod in Rome. This synod, just using synods, was by now the expected vehicle through which a pope would establish his agenda early in his pontificate. More recently, in the 20th century, popes tend to publish an encyclical to do that. Like within their first year, they'll put out an encyclical that states they don't always get to, sometimes events just, pull them in another direction. But they, it's sort of a statement. It's no surprise that Gregory continued the Cluny reform objectives, denouncing simony, denouncing clerical concubinage, denouncing clerical marriage. He also repromulgated Alexander II's 1063 decree that it was sinful for the faithful to attend Mass celebrated by a married priest. Now he adds, you see, each one is adding. So what he added, he extended the sin to those attending the Mass of a priest who was either known to be guilty of simony, that he purchased his office, or to be living in concubinage, meaning not necessarily married, but, living, cohabiting, so to speak. Quote, this is from the Synod. Those who have been advanced to any grade of holy orders, or to any office through simony, that is, by the payment of money, shall hereafter have no right to officiate in the Holy Church. Those also who have secured churches by giving money shall certainly be deprived of them. And in the future it shall be illegal for anyone to buy or to sell any ecclesiastical office, position, benefice, and he goes on a list. Nor shall clergymen who are married say Mass or serve the altar in any way. We decree that if they refuse to obey our orders, or rather those of the Holy Fathers, the people shall refuse to receive their ministrations, in order that those who disregard the love of God and the dignity of their office may be brought to their senses through feeling the shame of the world and the reproof of the people. Then Gregory took a new and bold step, which was not expected. He officially condemned the practice of lay investiture of a cleric with the symbols of his office by a layman. Now, we've seen previous popes allude to this, but he's much more direct. Quote, inasmuch as we have learned that, contrary to the establishments of the Holy Fathers, the investiture with churches is, in many places, performed by laypersons, and that, from this case, many disturbances arise in the Church, by which the Christian religion is trodden underfoot, we decree that no one of the clergy shall receive the investiture with a bishopric, or abbey, or church, from the hand of an emperor, or king, or any lay person, male or female. But if he shall presume to do so, he shall clearly know that such investiture is bereft of apostolic authority, and that he himself shall lie under excommunication until fitting satisfaction shall be rendered. So the Holy Roman Emperor, Heinrich IV, his temper, which was never entirely under control, exploded into rage when he heard this. Some of the most strategically important territories in his empire were in clerical hands. Cologne, Mainz, Trier, Milan. For the reasons as we introduced this whole problem under Otto I, the whole reason they would do this is so they knew that they could rely on those areas and that they would get it back. So if they put one of their priests or bishops or whatever in these positions, then that person was loyal, had that personal bond, but also because of the celibacy, that person would not have an heir. So when that bishop died, then the king would get the territory back and be able to name someone else. Whereas with other lands, if he gave a duchy of Swabia, to some family, well, then that duke who gets it, he's going to have a son, or if he does have a son, then that son will be the duke, and then that person's son, and so on. So then that duchy remains a vassal, but the emperor does not have complete control over it, the way he would, say, with the city of Cologne, if he puts a clericy trust in that position. And so he had to know. He couldn't, in his mind, his functional administrative apparatus, the perpetuating the continuity of his reign and his dynasty, was entwined with maintaining lay investiture. Now, initially, rather than openly defy the Pope, he thought he would just simply ignore the decree, as obviously so many were ignoring the decree against clerical marriage and concubinage, otherwise it wouldn't have to be repeated by every Pope. Now, that might have worked with some previous popes, but not with Gregory. In 1075, Pope Gregory escalated the affair by deposing the Bishop Herman of Bamberg on the grounds of simony. accusing him of having purchased his office. And he ordered a synod of German clerics to meet to implement the Cluny reforms in Germany. It met at Mainz in October of 1075. But as events developed, it was revealed that not all the clergy in Germany were of the same mind, that not all of them wanted to implement the Cluny reforms, not all of them were on the Pope's side, that there were many, again, because of reasons of feudalism, were on the emperor's side, rather than the Pope. So riots broke out in Mainz, and it spread. It wasn't just at the synod, it spread to the city. That there was this much resistance to enforcing, for example, clerical celibacy, 50 years after Benedict VIII's decree, shows how slowly this reform advanced. Heinrich considered the matter resolved because the synod at Mainz just broke up and didn't accomplish anything except violence. And he proceeded to invest his choice as Archbishop of Milan in northern Italy. This was a direct challenge to papal authority, which Gregory answered in kind. On the 8th of December, 1075, he ordered the Emperor Heinrich IV to reform his practices and surrender lay investiture, or he, quote, would not receive the blessing of God or the Pope. That was a threat to withhold imperial coronation in Rome. Heinrich retaliated. He summoned a meeting of German bishops to the city of Worms. It met on the 24th of January, 1076, at which those who attended, these obviously were Henry's guys, these bishops were loyal to him. So it's not every single German bishop, but a substantial number who were loyal to him as opposed to the Pope. This synod at Worms named Pope Gregory VII a perjurer, an adulterer, illegitimately elected, and a menace to the peace of Europe. They therefore declared him deposed. Every bishop present signed a document declaring that they would not swear allegiance to this pope. Pope Gregory responded the only way he could, or believed he could. On February 15th, 1076, Gregory excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, and declared that he was no longer the rightful ruler of a Christian people, and that his subjects were therefore absolved of their oath of loyalty to him. Henry responded on Easter Sunday by having one of his creature bishops excommunicate the Pope. This step, in retrospect, turned the tide in Gregory's favor, Pope Gregory's favor. There were some Germans who were of a mind to rebel against Henry, who for no reasons that had nothing to do with the church, just, standard ambition and greed. And they took this opportunity to do so. Henry almost lost his throne and his life in the subsequent fighting. He was then, in desperation, persuaded to make amends, for which purpose he made a pilgrimage to Canossa in January of 1077 to beg Gregory's forgiveness. He came barefoot in the snow in the garb of a penitent. In the same year, 1077, we'll pause in that chronology just because something else happened that year that's going to be of long-term importance. So we'll cover this section and then get back to Gregory. So the reason that I'm pausing is in 1077, the first medieval university was created. The Schola Medica Salernitana. It's the medical school at Salerno, Italy. That's in Campania, that's southwest Italy, that's the shin of Italy. Located on the Gulf of Salerno, 45 miles down coast from Naples. In terms of the movement of history and its institutional longevity, this can be understood in the context of medieval guilds of barber surgeons, to be discussed below. All right, Saint Alfano, Alfano, who served as Archbishop of Salerno from 1058 until his death in 1085, happened to be a physician and an accomplished linguist and an early translator of Greek and Arabic medical texts into Latin. This guy, Archbishop Alfano, was one of the founders and first faculty members of the medical school at Salerno. He recruited like-minded physicians from the Islamic world, one of which was ethnically Berber from North Africa, born in Carthage. This guy's original name has been lost, but he eventually converted and became a monk, a Benedictine. And in religion, after his conversion, he was known as Constantine Africanus. In 1077, Archbishop Alfano persuaded Constantine to join him in compiling a library at Salerno around which the medical school coalesced, with the goal of synthesizing the best medical knowledge from the Greco-Roman past along with contemporary Jewish and Islamic medical practices. Together, they made Salerno's medical library the most comprehensive, certainly in the Christian world, and therefore made Salerno a destination for those seeking medical care, as well as those wishing to be trained in medical care, wishing to become physicians. And at the end of his professional life, this Constantine became a monk. He retired to the monastery, Monte Cassino. Okay, so what is the connection between this medical school and universities? And as we'll see, the development of medieval universities is completely enmeshed with the development of scholasticism. So we begin by defining terms. Dialectic is the Greek word for, essentially, for a reasoned argument. It's derived from two Greek words. The prefix dia, dia, means across or between, and the suffix is from the verb legai, meaning to speak, so you're speaking back and forth. So dialectic is a debate. Schola is Latin word for a place of instruction, so school. A scholar, from the Latin scholasticus, means a man who has been instructed at such a place. Scholastic refers to a method of learning in such a place of instruction, in a schola, the method of the schola. Scholasticism describes a distinct educational system applying the dialectical method, meaning the debate argument method, to analyze and interpret texts of established authorities on matters, any matters. It could be medicine, later philosophy, theology, law, culminating in university. So universus, the Latin word universus, just means whole, or the entirety. The Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium was the term for a community of scholars and teachers, meaning multiple teachers, multiple disciplines joined together in an institutional construct. The idea for an institution focused on advanced learning was an ancient one. The academy was founded in Athens by Plato in 385 BC. The Lyceum was founded by Aristotle, also in Athens, in 335 BC. But all such pagan institutions were gradually closed after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 391 under the Emperor Theodosius I. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 and the development of the culturally blended successor kingdoms has already been summarized. An essential catalyst for the reconstitution of post-imperial Western civilization was a social construct to maintain the continuity of literacy and to act as a repository for the written heritage of the ancient world. This service was first provided by monasteries, in a way already covered. Particularly, refresh your memories with St. Isidore, what he took from Cassiodorus, the Trivium, the Quadrivium, the 3 books of sentences he wrote, the etymologies, the rule of St. Chrodegon, creating the cathedral school, cathedral chapter, expanded into the Schola Minor, the elementary school, where reading, writing, psalmody were taught, and the higher school, Schola Major, Schola Major, in which would consist of the 7 liberal arts, the Trivium and the Quadrivium. Both systems of education, the monastic and the cathedral, were supplemented owing to the unification of many of the successor kingdoms under the empire of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. The close working relationship Charlemagne developed with Pope Hadrian I had as one result an educational upgrade of Europe, spearheaded by the English scholar monk Alcuin of York. And he formalized the scriptorium as a place for systematic manuscript copying using a uniform penmanship, teaching manuscript illumination systematically as a form of sacred art, copying and distributing Roman liturgical books swiftly, and making use of Charlemagne's political unification to quickly distribute them across Europe. So all those things we've already covered. So the next thing, we've passed the year in time, but it would have just been kind of hanging if we had covered it there, so I mention it now. In the year 847, we find a Latin translation of Dionysius the Areopagite, subsequently referred to as Pseudo-Dionysius. By way of background, a person named John Scotus Erigena, E-R-I-G-E-N-A, was an Irish scholar who received patronage from the King of France, Charles the Bald, who was a grandson of Charlemagne. One result of being supported enough to just be a full-time scholar was his translation of 4 Neoplatonic works attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, who was believed to be St. Paul's convert in Athens, mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, verse 34, and later became the first bishop of that city. These 4 works: first, on the celestial hierarchy; second, on mystical theology; third, on the divine names; fourth, on the ecclesiastical hierarchy. These were first quoted by Severus, Bishop of Antioch, from 512 to 518, in support of his Monophysite Christology. No previous church council or church father had quoted any of these writings or any other writing attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite. This is unusual if the writings of a Pauline disciple had survived intact. Bishop Severus was condemned for his heretical views, but no one questioned the Dionysian authorship of the text he quoted. Merely, they just said he just used them incorrectly. So, these works were taken as the product of a Pauline disciple. Therefore, these works became immensely popular in the medieval period after John Scotus made them accessible through a Latin translation. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas, the later great Dominican theologian and doctor of the Church, has 1,700 quotes from the work attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, using him as a source on ancient mystical theology. The identification of these works with Dionysius the Areopagite was first challenged in the Renaissance by a Florentine humanist named Lorenzo Valla. He argued that Neoplatonism as a philosophy did not develop until 2 centuries after the death of the New Testament Dionysius. So the conventional hypothesis to account for this is that the works were composed by a late 5th century Syrian Christian Neoplatonist who repudiated the Christology of the Council of Chalcedon, which defined the two natures of Christ, as God and man. And so that this guy essentially made this up and falsely attributed them to Dionysius in order to support Monophysite Christology. Now, the church has never, to my knowledge, has never pronounced on this. So they could actually be the work of Dionysius or not. We're not required, to give assent either way. But the works are valuable historically, as they're ancient, whoever wrote them, and they were used throughout the medieval period. And in the medieval period, no one questioned that they were the works of Dionysius, a convert of St. Paul. 3 years later, 850, we find evidence for the existence of medieval guilds. Guilds. Guilds developed in the Middle Ages as associations of individuals engaged in the same endeavor for the purpose of mutual assistance, setting standards, and protection. Such associations existed under the Roman Empire. They had legal recognition. They were called the colleges, from the Latin collegium, meaning a company or a fellowship. They disappeared when the Western Empire fell, but the memory of their existence remained, and some records survived in the care of the Church. So as Western society returned to a semblance of cohesion in the Carolingian period, the legal category of collegia for skilled craftsmen and merchants was revived. The word guild is derived from a German word gilde, Gilde, meaning payment, as joining a guild required payment of a fee and remaining a member required paying dues. So the first recorded mention of such a revived collegium as a guild is in a complaint from the Bishop of Rheims named Hincmar in 858. He denounced one such guild in Rheims for their drunken behavior during Christmas, at a Christmas feast. Since it would not have occurred to the medieval mind that any endeavor could or should take place apart from religion, these groups took a patron saint, they adopted particular devotions, and they had chaplains. In other words, the medieval guild, developed as a religious confraternity for those in specialized trades. As they grew in numbers, there was an obvious need for structure. The most enduring church model for a successful group endeavor was the rule of St. Benedict. So medieval guild structure made use of that. They weren't monks, but they just took some of those ideas and repurposed them and reformulated them for use in their endeavor. So analogous to the rule, the regula, guilds develop professional standards and ethics for their members to follow. Monasteries were known for certain specialities, raising animals, maintaining farms, growing vineyards, others for sacred art, for manuscript illumination, size of their library, for their high liturgy. So guilds reflected this in their own specialization: carpenters, tailors, merchants, blacksmiths, stonemasons. Monastic life was open to anyone who had the calling and the ability to live the life. So were guilds. Monasteries had an internal hierarchical governing structure, which was surprisingly democratic. The community of a monastery, or at least those with sufficient seniority to be in the chapter, had a say in who moved from postulant to novice, from novice to professed, and they elected the abbot, the prior, and the abbot. And they could actually remove an abbot. It wasn't easy, but there is a way to remove the abbot, that the community could remove their abbot. Guilds adopted an analogous internal hierarchy along same lines and set fairly democratic procedures for the movement from apprentice to journeyman to master. So apprentice, that is from the Latin verb apprendere, meaning to grasp in the sense of to learn, like you're grasping, you're learning. So that's what an apprentice is, in the process of learning. Journeyman, derived from the Latin diurnum for day, and that moved into the French as the journée, the day man, a day worker. The journeyman is a day worker. And the master, the magister, means a chief, meaning in the sense of one in authority. So the next contributing development took place around the turn of the millennium, around the year 1000, with Islamic interest in Aristotle, based on text translated into Arabic 300 years earlier, around 750. The first exponent of, at least who became known in the West, influenced the West, the first exponent of Islamic Aristotelianism was known in the West as Avicenna. Now that's a euphemisation of the name Abu Ali al-Hussein bin Sina, S-I-N-A. So he's best known as Avicenna in the West. A-V-I-C-E-N-N-A. He was a Neoplatonist philosopher born in present-day Iran, so ethnically Persian, religiously Shiite Muslim, very devout, could recite the entire Quran from memory. He lived in a period when Shiite Islam was amenable to Western ideas, enabling the emergence of the Falasifa. Those were Hellenistic Muslims, meaning influenced by Greek, the Hellenes, by Greek philosophy, who acted as apologists in Islam, arguing that the truths attained by human reason using Greek methods are ultimately consistent with what was revealed by Allah to Muhammad. Avicenna's contribution to this was an attempt at a concord between Neoplatonism and Aristotle. He had prestige because he was a doctor. He was a medical professional, serving as court physician to the rulers of Persia. And he wrote two books, two works that became medical texts in the Islamic world. One titled The Book of Healing, the other titled The Canon of Medicine. The influence of Aristotle was in terms of empiricism. It's from the Greek word empirikos, which means experience. So we learn through experience. We learn through doing. So I could describe a ruler to you, and you could probably form an image in your mind, or you could just take the ruler. I could hand you a ruler, and you could feel it. Look, okay, this one. All right, this one's wood. Has some plastic. It's this long, and it has two sets of measurements, one on each side. See, but not all rulers are like this. So that's how Aristotle said, okay, this is how you learn. And so this empirical method, of course, is of obvious utility and necessity for a doctor, for a physician. So with that in mind, here's an excerpt from his book on medicine, Canon on Medicine, that reveals Aristotle's influence. And this is a work that would make its way to the West. It was in the library at Salerno, and it's gonna show the influence of Aristotle's Aristotelian reasoning based on causation, which is going to influence later scholastics like Aquinas. Quote, medicine considers the human body as to the means by which it is cured and by which it is driven away from health. The knowledge of anything, since all things have causes, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes. Therefore, in medicine, we ought to know the causes of sickness and health, and because health and sickness and their causes are sometimes manifest, sometimes hidden, and not to be comprehended except by the study of symptoms, we must also study the symptoms of health and the symptoms of disease. Now it is established in the sciences that no knowledge is acquired save through the study of its causes and beginnings. If it has causes and beginnings, nor completed except by knowledge of its accidents and accompanying essentials. Of these causes, there are 4 kinds: material causes, efficient causes, formal causes, final causes. Material causes, on which health and sickness depend, are the affected member, which is the immediate subject, and the humors, and in these are the elements. And these 2 are subjects that, according to their mixing together, alter. In the composition and alteration of the substance, which is thus composed, a certain unity is attained. So, the method is the important thing, the causation. Now, obviously, the humors, that's not... But just the idea of looking at cause and effect. And really, without microscopes, and they really were kind of limited. So that's where the humors, come from, analogous to the, this would be the choleric, the melancholic, the sanguine, and the 4 humors. Choleric, phlegmatic, the phlegm, those 4 humors. Efficient causes are the causes changing and preserving the conditions of the human body as heirs, and what are united with them, and evacuation and retention, and districts and cities, and habitable places, and what are united with them, and changes in age and diversities in it, and in races, and arts, and manners, and bodily and animate movings and restings, and sleeping and waking on account of them, and in things which befall the human body when they touch it, or are either in accordance or at variance with nature. Now, all of that was one sentence. One sentence. Formal causes are physical constitutions and combinations and virtues which result from them. Final causes are operations, and in the science of operations lies the science of virtues, as we have set forth. These are the subjects of the doctrine of medicine, whence one inquires concerning the disease and curing of the human body. One ought to attain perfection in this research, namely, how health may be preserved and sickness cured. And in the causes of this kind are rules in eating and drinking, and the choice of air, and the measure of exercise and rest, and doctoring with medicines, and doctoring with the hands. All this, with physicians, is according to 3 species: the well, the sick, and the medium, of whom we have spoken. Okay, the intrinsic dualism of Neoplatonism was acceptable to Islam, and Aristotelian empiricism offered a useful methodology in Avicenna's profession. His commentaries on Aristotle followed the Muslim trade routes to Islamic Spain, where they would later prove useful to scholastics such as Aquinas. And so the first medieval university started, in effect, as a trade school, established by a guild of barber surgeons, of medical doctors, at Salerno for the purpose of establishing standards and training in their field. The field of medicine had been plagued by many bizarre and outlandish practices. The location in southern Italy was not an accident. It was in the Norman region, which first had access to translations of medical texts from ancient Greece and from Avicenna, from the territory they conquered, from the Muslims who were on the island of Sicily. Pope Gregory VII forgave the Emperor Henry IV at Canossa, located 105 miles southeast of Milan. In the course of a meeting from January 25th through January 28th, 1077, at which Henry did penance, begging forgiveness. Supposedly he stood barefoot in the snow, he wore a hair shirt, and publicly begged forgiveness. But once, and Gregory forgave him, so then Henry used this to secure his position back in Germany. Once that position was secure, he went right back to it. He began choosing his own bishops again and investing them with the symbols of office. So in the year 1080, Pope Gregory, once again, excommunicated and deposed him. Henry responded by sponsoring the creation of anti-pope Clement III. Henry followed this up by seizing Rome in March of 1084. Gregory could have been killed, probably would have been, but he was rescued again by, of all people, the Normans, who, whatever their faults, at least these particular Normans, they kept their word. Robert Guiscard, who had carved a Norman kingdom for himself, was loyal to his promise to defend the papacy. He saved Gregory's life, and he chased the Germans out of Rome. But he had no intention of staying in Rome for a long-term occupation. He never promised that. So he said, protect the Pope, but not occupy Rome long-term. So Gregory had to remain with the Normans for protection. He therefore lived in exile until his death at Salerno, and he received hospitality from the same Archbishop Alfano, whom we previously met, one of the founders of the medical school at Salerno, which turned out to be the first medieval university. 2 months before his own death, Robert Guiscard ordered a marble tomb for the Pope in St. Matthew the Apostle Church in Naples. And Pope Gregory died on the 25th of May, 1085. Let's see. I see this is... All right. I'm going to stop here because next we're going to get to the First Crusade. And since this one's almost 2 hours, we'll stop there. And then we will move into the First Crusade. So for the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.